Scene one, Apple, take one.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shane Borza. Welcome to another episode of Filmmakers, the show where I talk to people in the industry and get their notes on what they're doing and what they've learned. Today, I have Matt Glass with me, who is a filmmaker and composer. And this is doubly fun for me because this is one of the few guests that I don't know personally, but he was recommended by two previous guests who are friends of mine. But also, he's one of my favorite kind of people, multi-hyphenate. Like, he does a lot of different roles. And as I mentioned, we're going to be talking predominantly about the two big things he does, which is all aspects of filmmaking, but also all aspects of music. So, Matt, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. We're doing it.
So as I mentioned, I don't know you personally, so I just wanted to get a little background as far as, like where you are and how you got into what you're doing. And I don't know if you started with one aspect or the other, or if you went to school for those or what have you. So give us the quick Matt 101.
All right. I was born in New Jersey as a young child. Then I raised in Utah since I was like one. I'm trying to think of how it all started. It's all a blur. In school, I was in jazz band. I was a percussion guy, so I was in the percussion class and in the jazz band class, and I was in rock bands in high school and post high school, and I was in bands that we did some touring around the Southwest in the early 2000s or whatever it was. And then I went to school and I was taking a photography class. And at the time, I think I was a music major, but every music class in my college, at least, was only 1 credit. And most classes are 3 credits. So you had to basically take 3 times as many credits to become the music major because it took forever. So I had taken percussion class 5 times and jazz band 5 times and orchestra and all that. And I was in the photography class and I was enjoying it. And my teacher was like, yeah, you should think about becoming a photography major. And I was just like, okay. So then I became a photography major, and then I left school for 3 years to tour with my band and stuff. And then when I came back, I started doing more photography, but I had this whole background of music. And so both of those things were always on my mind. And eventually I got a bachelor's degree in photography, and I started taking these cinematic photos where I would shoot it like a film where it was lit cinematically, and we had actors performing, and it was a tableau, a whole setup. And then with each of these pictures, I would also write a song, a little bit of a score for each photograph that would go along with it. I made a CD when I'd have gallery shows, so you could look at the images and then take a CD and listen to what the music for each image was. And I also put them on the web and all that. And so was my early first taste of filmmaking. I also made movies with my friends, but it was before SLRs came out, so it never looked good, and we obviously weren't trying that hard, so nobody acted well. There was no good script. It was just for fun, but it was a great exercise. But I did try to make 1 or 2 really serious things, and they were awful, and I was like, these are terrible. I need to just focus. So that's how I got into the photography stuff. It's I'm just going to focus on making 1 frame look cinematic first, and then when I can start doing that, then we'll start to move to moving images. I'm kind of bouncing all over the place. Anyway, after I got my bachelor's degree, I did some gallery shows and did some work as a photo assistant and was doing music on the side as well the whole time. I hadn't scored anything at this point, but it was rock band music and a little bit of orchestral pop and stuff. And then I went and I got my master's degree in photography from Cranbrook Academy of Art in Detroit. And the weird thing about that is that school doesn't have classes. It's just studio time. So you work in your studio, and then you get critiques, and there's book club where you each have different reading lessons and lectures and all that kind of stuff. But there's no class structure. It's also interesting because I went there for photography for 2 years, and I think I took 1 photo the whole time I was there. Since it's all self-motivated, I was like, I kind of want to learn After Effects, and I want to make movies. So I started making shorts that were just me, with puppets. And that way I had full control, and I wasn't embarrassed about my lack of skill because I was just me. So I knew I could just keep working until it felt as close to real as I could. And then I think I got some virtual instruments for my computer that like were based on real orchestral instruments. So it was like real strings and stuff that you could control. And I scored one of the short films I did, which was a very stupid film about a guy and macaroni art and a car crash. And it was very weird, but it was the first thing I ever scored to picture. And I was like, oh, this is fun. And so I kept doing that in school. And then after I graduated from Cranbrook, me and a friend of mine decided that we're going to move to LA. And so we had all these artist friends, and I had been doing video editing and video stuff the whole time I was there. So I was like, what if we just make short docs about a bunch of people we went to high school or college with, or like people we were influenced by that we can like sneak into their lives by like saying, hey, we want to film you. So we started doing these short 7-minute docs for YouTube. And then I started scoring those and started doing the music for those. And some of those, it was really smart because like most people want, like they'd love to have like a documentary about them or like some way to promote themselves. And then so we're filming this nice doc about them, and they're getting to know us, and then suddenly we've built this connection, and then they'll like have other jobs for us, and then it kind of like snowballed into more work. And then somehow through that, several steps down the line, we made connections with other filmmakers, which led us to making several feature films, which I've scored, and I ended up directing a couple. And I guess I'm not getting into too much specifics at this point, but we can get into those later. Anyway, and then that's kind of how I got to where I am now. Oh, in an overview way, if that makes sense.
It does all, and just for people who are listening, and this is something I've talked about with other people, you know, there are certain things I think, you know, within the industry like make sense to people, but outside may not. But I found that there's this through line. I mean, you look at history, a lot of people, you know, that's where the term like Renaissance man comes from. You know, they had a lot of different, especially artistic interests, and those things all led to them not only being well versed across disciplines, like they did art and they painted, you know, or sculpture, and they wrote, you know, and they were scientists and inventors, and because the eye or the lessons that they learned from one discipline would help them in others, even if some were more pedestrian, like, well, I'm a writer, but I like to paint just for fun, but that would give them inspiration to help with their writing, for instance. So when I hear somebody like what you just mentioned, like, oh, I went to school for photography and I had a band, and like, of course you became a filmmaker, like that makes sense to me. But I think sometimes from the outside, people might wonder like, well, how are they able to do all these things? They're so different, and not see how they're so complementary. So I appreciate, and I'm able to follow that thread like all the way through. But also when I went to film school, we had a number of people there who had previously gone to art school and had done a lot of like what you were talking about with like stills or tableaus, or like learning, you know, what have you, like pottery and all these things, that then when they realized, well, now that I've gotten 2, 3, 4 years of art school in me, I figured out what discipline I want to focus on, which is film. And then they would go to film school, and it was almost like when you talked about getting the master's, it's like, oh, their bachelor's, so to speak, was art school, and their master's was like film school, because now they have taken this broad range approach of like learning all the interdisciplinary arts and figured out a focus. The thing I'm really interested in, because I don't have any musical background, is when you look through the lens of either a photo like still camera or a video camera, as far as like seeing imagery, how does that compare as like seeing or perhaps hearing music? I'm not sure if it's, especially if it's things that you're making on your own, like, are you making the documentary and then once you watch it at the end, are you starting to be like, oh, I can hear the music that goes in? Or do they get created simultaneously? Or do you have like a certain sound in your head and you wanted a visual that matches it? Like, how does the process of those things work? Because I don't have any kind of understanding of like music.
Good question. I think because I mean, I had some training as like a drummer and percussionist, but I don't have like real music training. Like I never took music theory or anything like that, which is like taking those classes is probably the most helpful thing in the world. And I probably should have done it. But because I didn't, if I am scoring something and I'm like, oh, I really like this music, or I really like this score. I want to use that as like my inspiration for this. And when I get to do it, I can't do it right. Like I feel like there's this thing, especially people starting out, where they become like sound-alike artists, almost like, oh, I like John Williams so much, my scores are going to start sounding like John Williams at the beginning. And I never had that because, well, I couldn't sound like John Williams even if I tried. But I I didn't have the exact skills to do it, so nothing ever perfectly emulated what I was trying to do, and it was always a little bit slightly off. So I kind of ended up in these like little off-center areas. And I guess it depends on the project. Like sometimes I would have a clear idea of what the music would be because of the visuals, and sometimes not. I think also when I was a kid, I used to in undergrad especially, I would sleep through a lot of my like core classes, like history and stuff. I mean, I liked listening to it, but I was tired, I guess. And I would always listen to music in my car before and after class, and I'd just be like daydreaming in class, drawing like images of like cool story ideas or like the visual that I had for what this music was. So it was always tied together for me, the visual and the music. And I guess this doesn't directly relate, but what you were saying before, I feel like I'm trying to think of a way to say, well, like say you're a person and you have like a cough and you are short of breath, and you like, these are two different things, and a cough and a short of breath is the similar thing for me. Was like I loved music and I loved images, and these were two things I had. Oh, I think I have a cough and I think I have a shortness of breath, when really you have asthma is the thing. And for me, it was like I like music and I like visuals. Oh, I'm a filmmaker, and it just turned out like I didn't know those were the symptoms. Those weren't the thing that I liked, and the thing I like is the film. And so they just have always gone hand in hand in some way. It was a really weird metaphor, I think. But and I have asthma also. So
Well, it's funny. I didn't realize you had asthma, but as I was telling you before we started rolling, that I have this bad cough post-COVID. So I was like, this is a very apt description for me right now.
I get this.
But to go back to what you were just talking about, the different aspects of filmmaking, I came in as a writer. I have a writing degree, and I have a friend of mine who, if people aren't aware, I forget, it was the first, I think it was the second season of the show, Mike Fitzgerald, who's a professional editor, a video editor, but he was the first friend of mine that went to film school. And then like through him, I was like helping him edit scripts and like learning, the layout of a script and like the formatting and whatever. And he was like sending me all his assignments. So I kind of went to film school like through him. And that was how I realized, oh, there's all these disciplines. It's writing and it's set design and like all the things from theater, wardrobe and costume, and it's the science of cameras and lenses and sound, and like you have to learn all those technical skills. And it's I really love the idea of like that interdisciplinary, or like you were talking about, like what you see and what you hear and how they work together. And it's funny, if you've ever gone into, and this is a little like telling of my age, but when DVD special features were like the thing, you would go into the special features, or you would listen to the commentary, and sometimes they would give you options where they will show the scene with like different test music, or someone's doing a voiceover and they had the 2 or 3 choices, and it very much can change the feel or tone of something, where everything you're seeing is the same, but what you're hearing is different.
Oh yeah.
I did want to shift a little bit though and talk about some of the things you mentioned, because I did a dive. You sent me a media folder, which was great, and I had all these like trailers and things, and you had a lot of different styles of things in there, like some stop animation stuff or more animation stuff, and then some different genres of filmmaking. So talk to me a little bit about the evolution there. You mentioned making features. So of course, we usually start either music videos or short films or what have you, and then we get to the features. So how did you go about making decisions within or between genres? Are you interested in all of those things? Was it just an opportunity, like someone wanted you to make a documentary and you did, but you didn't care about those? Or is that something you always wanted to make? So that's kind of the first part. And then the second part is, what was the evolution of going from those shorter projects to getting yourself to be more of a feature filmmaker?
The I think the documentaries, I mean, I love making them, but I think it was just kind of a necessity. Was the fastest way to have an end product because you didn't have to worry about script writing so much for the short docs, and it was also a great learning experience because we're meeting artists and filmmakers and learning from them as we are putting this stuff together. And it's weird, like there's never a straight path, like a definable path on how to get somewhere, because like we did a documentary on one guy. How did this work? There's so many random documentaries. Well, ended up doing a documentary series for the Jim Henson Company. They were working on this web series, and we ended up doing like a behind the scenes documentary that was supposed to be about like the YouTube people that were writing and directing the show, but we became so obsessed with the puppet makers that we were like, can we please make it about them as well, because they're so interesting. And so we became friends with these puppet people, and I had already done all this puppet stuff in grad school, which I did. I mean, I always liked puppets, but it was also out of necessity because there were no actors there in grad school. So it's like, anyway. And then that led, so we met those Jim Henson people, and then it was like, well, I have all these projects. Would you guys want to work on something? And then suddenly I'm making short films with Jim Henson people who are building the puppets for me, and we're doing it just in my yard and all that kind of stuff. And I never would have expected when I was making puppets in grad school that I would be like working with the Jim Henson Company people or people of that quality. It was pretty incredible. And that was just like one branch of the tree that went off in that direction. And I've always been interested in like more genre storytelling and just things like reality is already there. So we might as well like watch stuff that is a little bit different. You know what I mean? If we want something that's very real, just like, you know, go outside or something. But that being said, I like movies like that too. But and then there was another one. We did a short doc on this internet filmmaker, comedian guy named Sandeep Parikh, who was on The Guild, and he had a web series that he created called Legend of Neil that my business partner was a huge fan of. And through him, we ended up meeting Bria Grant, who's an actress and filmmaker, and because they did a thing together. And then a couple of years later, we did a short film with her, and then she's like, I want to do this feature film called 12-Hour Shift. And then that's how we ended up going in that direction for that feature film. But like, again, it was never like, there's never a clear path. Like I had no idea who would have led to, if any of these things would have ended up where they ended up. We also did a short documentary on, because of I like puppets, I was like, we should find a puppeteer to do a documentary on. So I think we did a Craigslist ad asking for a puppeteer. We met this guy who did marionette puppets for a puppet nightclub in LA where you go and you can like dance with all the puppets, and there's a bunch of puppeteers. So we filmed him, and it turned out to be, the club was owned by David Arquette, and he saw the video and liked it. And then he had some documentary stuff that he wanted to do. So we ended up meeting with him, and then he ended up being in some of our films and doing documentary stuff with him as well. And it's just like, I don't know how any of it happened or how I got to any of those things. I could never like spell that out for someone like, oh, you just got to find a weird puppeteer online and you'll be set, because you never know what's going to happen. I think that was most of your question. I'm trying to remember.
Well, see, let me jump in on that, because you know that it's a little kind of early in the show, but it doesn't really matter. Whenever a good note comes up, and that is a great note, which is you never know. I mean, the old joke in the industry is you ask 100 people how they got in the industry, you're gonna get 100 different answers, because it's about, I mean, you have to put in the work, and you got to go to school, you got to learn how to do whatever the thing is you want to do. But after that, it's a little bit of being in the right place at the right time, you know, meeting people who know people, or like you said, hey, we'll put a Craigslist ad in, and next thing you know, we met a guy who is in the place that's owned by the guy who the guy is interested in. Right. You know, but in order for that to happen, you have to have the output, which is, oh, he saw our video, which means you made something and completed it, which is, you know, a lot of people.
Yeah, I was just going to say, completing it is the hardest.
It doesn't finish, but it was also good enough that they were like, oh, I like, you know, this is great. I was laughing when I was looking at your media stuff, and I was like, oh, You Can't Kill David Arquette. I love that movie. I'd seen that years ago on Hulu when it came out. So if people don't know about that, you know, I'll put the poster up or whatever. It's a great film. But so talk about how, like you mentioned, you met, he was a fan of your work, and then you started working together. You know, how did that project come to be? Because if people aren't aware, I mean, they might only know David Arquette, you know, being an actor or whatever. You know, he really was in the wrestling world. And for better or worse, that, you know, those two worlds sometimes compete with each other, film world and wrestling world. But even I, who was a fan of his and was a fan of wrestling, I didn't know a lot of that backstory. So I think it can be a pretty fascinating film for people, whether they come in cold or they like wrestling or they like David Arquette or whatever, or even they just like good documentaries. And I would argue that's a great documentary. So talk to me a little bit about how that specifically came from this happy accident from a Craigslist ad to this feature coming out.
Yeah, so we had after the documentary about the puppeteer, we had done a couple of little short projects that didn't get off the ground and little ads and stuff with David Arquette and his wife. And then when we were doing 12-hour shift, I think we asked for their help to produce that film, the feature film. And I think it was either at the same time or maybe right after. It was probably around the same time or before. They were working on a documentary about him and his wrestling past and like him getting back in shape and all this kind of stuff. And it sounded fine. I was like, that's fine. And then we saw the film and it's really good and it's really interesting. And you don't have to like wrestling to like it, and you get to like see like a human side of somebody that you've seen like on TV and film for so long. And it was really, really interesting. But that film in particular, we weren't involved until post, and me and my business partner, Jordan, we were post producers on it. So we just helped the post process a little bit, get things done. We saw like cuts of the film, and then I also scored it, which was really fun. And that was a rush too. I think I did my portion of the music in like a couple days, maybe a week or something like that. And it was really intense. And they were always really supportive of my music too. And I was doing some really intense things for some of those scenes, like the scene where he gets his neck cut and stuff. Like I did this like really intense, like synthy driving music, and they thought it was great and it was really fun. And I got to experiment with a bunch of other weird types of music and stuff, and it was very interesting. But it was just because we were working on these other films. I think I had done the score for 12-hour shift at this point, which David and his wife Christina produced with us. So they had heard that and they're like, "Oh, you should do this score." And so it kind of just all happened at the same time. And it was it was like a juggling act for like 2 or 3 years there. There was like so many things happening at once. And I was like, this is crazy. And then COVID happened, obviously, and that changes a lot of stuff. But I don't even know if that's a clear path on how I got there, but it happened in such a weird way that I don't even know if I could define how I went from that puppeteer to like scoring that film, but it's there.
And again, these sometimes are murky things as we're going through them, and then they're very clear once we look back. You're like, oh, A led to B led to C. And sometimes it's just like, I still don't know. I've talked to a lot of people that have said things like I'm still not sure how this happened, but here I am. So again, that makes sense to me, and I think is very common in the industry. Actually, I was just listening to WTF Mark Barron podcast with Malcolm McDowell, and he told the story of how the Singing in the Rain part of the Kubrick film Clockwork Orange happened, which was completely by accident.
Nice.
And it seems like such an instrumental part of the film. But when he tells the story, it's like, well, so one day we were hanging on set and Stanley asked if I could dance. And first thing that popped in my head was the song and dance of Gene Kelly from Singing in the Rain. And Kubrick was just like breaking up and thinking it was amazing and immediately went out and got the rights to the song. And that's how it ended up being in the movie. Not planned at all. So these happy accidents do happen, and they've been happening all throughout recorded, art and history. Mm-hmm. I did want to have us talk about COVID a little bit because that is a huge pivot for a lot of people, especially in the industry. But before we get there, you were talking about the kind of nightmare rush to get all the music done. And if you're watching the show, you can see that behind Matt, there's some like guitars or something sticking up. So I wanted to ask though, what do you do when you compose? Do you still have a band? Are you playing all instruments yourself? Do you write the music and somebody else records it? Like, what's the process for you to compose music, whether it's for that project or any other?
Hey everyone, sorry to stop the show, but we have to pay some bills around here. And to do that, I wanted to point out a couple things I have on offer at my site, shaneborza.com. If you scroll down to my courses, you can see I have both a content creator live class and a DIY version. These teach you everything you need to know from a production standpoint so you can either get a writing project done, an audio project, or a film project. Doesn't matter, it works for everyone. If you scroll down, you can see some of my clients and some of the testimonials people have left telling you how helpful this has been for them. So I hope you check that out. You can also go to my shop and you can see all that I have on offer, to include coaching programs, audio stuff like soundtracks, film production stuff. I have filmmaker bundles, all types of things you might need to help you get your art out into the world. As you can see, I also have a number of books. They are all on Apple Books. So you can go to my site and get them directly, or you can go to Apple Books, put my name in, and then you can see all the books there. They are easily downloadable and you can read them on an iPad or something like that. There are coaching books here. There are poetry and photo books here. And I'm very excited. I just updated my Film Notes workbook and Film Notes book. They are expanded and updated 2023 editions. So please check those out if you want some extra stuff to help teach you production. And now back to the show.
At this point for me, I'm mostly doing it myself. I play on piano, which the thing about me playing piano is like, people are like, oh, you play piano, because I like make piano music, but I can't play it very well by hand or like myself. So I'll play piano and I'll like have the emotion of it, but sometimes I won't be getting the right chords, but I know like the rhythm and I know basically what I want. And because it's all done in MIDI, I can literally like shift the notes to the right notes while I'm doing it. So it's still like, it gives it a human feeling, but it's like, if I didn't live in this technology age, there's no way I could be a composer unless I was doing just percussion, because percussion is the one thing that I like get. Recently I've been experimenting with acoustic guitar stuff. I did a score with acoustic guitar, and that's my wife's guitar in the back also. Initially it was mostly with virtual instruments. Like I said, like people record libraries of violin, like playing every possible articulation, and then you can like control it so it feels, you can make it sound very real, but it's obviously not. And then as I've been getting further and further along, I'm trying to implement as many real instruments as I can. I'm also just realized my speakers were probably on. I also create a lot of instruments, well, make sound effects and then put them into the computer and learn how to manipulate them and make them into a more like tonal sounding instrument. So I've been doing that a lot more lately, trying to get away from the in the box sound, try to make things sound a little bit more original. And like using more live vocalists, like I'll sing a lot of stuff for my wife, or we'll bring people in and that kind of stuff. I would love, and maybe on the next, it just depends on budget, to like record with a real orchestra and all that would be pretty amazing. Or even just a solo, more solo instrumentalist people come in and record would be a delight. But you know, it just depends on the project and the budget for the music. 12-hour shift was just me, and it was like it's mostly drums, which was me. I have an electronic drum set, and I just played that mostly. And then string quartet stuff, which was all done digitally. And I tried to manipulate it so it would sound even more fake sometimes, like notes would like cut off prematurely or like bend down in weird ways. And then like I found this weird opera instrument that you could play where it's all these opera voices. And I'm like, this is the weirdest combo. So it was like kind of heavy metal drums sometimes with cellos like playing like the heavy metal guitar parts and then like opera on top. And it was a lot of fun.
A couple of follow-up questions there, because again, I think a lot of people won't know. I mean, even a lot of filmmakers, I've only done a couple projects where I had someone working with me, like musically. One was a film where I had a composer, you know, once we were in the edit mode. And then someone else, this was my first soundtrack. So fun fact for listeners who probably know, my wife and I had the world's first wedding on El Capitan in Yosemite. So we have a feature like award-winning documentary about that. And I was able to put out a soundtrack of original music with a friend of mine who's like a singer, songwriter type, you know, acoustic type person. And so he was able to send me music, or me say, God, I love this song, but you know, you're singing and there's a lot of talking. And he's like, well, I'll just send you the no voice version. And I was like, what? You know, so it was great to work with someone because I had this, whatever, 24 song catalog basically. And they were like, use whatever you want. But that was all music that was already done. So the question is, when you get something that needs original music, you know, what's the process of that? Do you have specific notes, like we need 1 minute and 17 seconds worth of this kind of music, so make something? Is it watch the movie and make stuff, see what happens? Like, what does that look like as far as kind of pairing that? Here's a film that needs music. You're a person that makes music. How do those two things fit together so that at the end there is some kind of score?
Nice. Well, I think it depends on the film. Mostly the way I've done for features has been, and I know a lot of composers don't like temp music because it's like putting you in a box. But like I said before, I can't do sound alikes. So like, I talk with the director. I'm like, whatever I'm going to do, I hope you don't think it's going to sound like this, because there's no way I'm going to copy this music. That's just not what I do. So I like temp music specifically as an edit, because I do a lot of editing as well. It shows me exactly where they want music and sort of what the emotion is. Oh, this music's weird and kind of dark. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. It won't sound like that, but it's going to be weird and dark. Or like sometimes I interpret the music wrong and they meant it to be like a sweet song, but I interpret it, a little bit more sinister, and then suddenly it changes the music, what they wanted. Maybe it's for the better, maybe it's for the worse. Anyway, but the temp music tells me, oh, at 1 minute and 45 seconds they want music, and then at 2 minutes it starts to fade for 5 seconds. So now I have this sort of like roadmap of what exactly they want. Also, normally you have spotting sessions with a director where they literally just point that out and say 1 minute 36, I want music to be tough and a driving beat, and then it cuts out when they talk for 5 seconds and that kind of stuff. That's also a good way to do it. But with Bria Grant, who did 12-Hour Shift, we never really had this spotting session. It was just based on temp music, which now that I think about it, I feel like the temp music in that film, that's the one that had the that I ended up doing the opera and the heavy metal stuff. I think it was all 90s rock and punk music, and so it went in a whole different direction. But we were both like really loved the Us soundtrack, Jordan Peele's movie Us, and just obsessed with the weird vocals and weird percussion. And so initially I sent her a bunch of just weird rough tracks being like, what about this direction? And she'd be like, oh, I don't like the synths, I don't like this. So I would learn, okay, no synthesizers in this score, none of this in that score. And then by the end I had a palette of several instruments that I knew, okay, this is what we're doing with. And then I came up with like character themes, different instrumentation and different melodies. And then after you do a couple things that get approved, like introducing a character, and now like, okay, that theme is working, she likes that theme for the character, I can sprinkle that in whenever it happens again, and then go from there. And I like to, there are some composers that will just make cool sounding bits of music, like a minute of cool beat or a cool like synthesized pads or whatever, and you can just place that. I like usually to compose to picture, which I mean most composers do, I guess. I haven't worked with that many other composers, but in a movie like 12-Hour Shift, it gets so insane by the end that I'm like calling back a bunch of the melodies and a bunch of the things that I've already done. So it's literally like it shows a picture, like it cuts to a person for 3 seconds and you'll hear their theme, and it cuts away and suddenly they're jumping. It's almost like cartoon music, where it's like so specific to everything that's happening in the end that you couldn't really do that if you had done it beforehand. So I guess to answer your question, every possible way that you could compose for a person is how I end up doing it for a film. And sometimes there is one track on 12-Hour Shift, again, I'm talking about that one, but that it was supposed to be for the end of the film, and I loved it, and it didn't work. It was like this 3-minute piece of music that I love, and it's like, it's just not the right tone, but I ended up being able to save the beginning of that and use it earlier in the film. So I guess sometimes you can move stuff around. But yeah, I just keep thinking about 12-Hour Shift and how weird it is. I haven't seen it in 4 years. I got to rewatch that movie. But the thing is, like, when you're scoring a film or doing whatever you're doing on a film, like I had to watch that thing like 100 times. So when it comes out, you're just like, oh, it's great. Hopefully there's enough time passes where you can eventually enjoy it again. But anyway.
Well, and that's another interesting note. I've heard a lot of interviews, especially with actors or even directors, where some people will say, primarily actors, they never watch their work. And others, they're like huge fans of and so proud of the final thing, and they watch it all the time. And so, but it definitely can. And then again, that's something that people outside the industry may not know. Like if you're scoring music, you spent 500 hours of that movie, not 2 hours of that movie, because like you said, you're watching it so many times or going over certain scenes. You know, today we're going to do these scenes, and you just spend all day on 3 scenes or what have you.
Sometimes there'll be like 10 seconds of the film that you'll just be looping over and over again while you're messing with stuff. And it's just like, it'll be like 30 minutes later and you're like, I can't believe I'm still listening to this one bit of dialogue, and it can drive you crazy.
Well, one last thing on that before we move on, you mentioned the like Us soundtrack, for instance. So what is either some top influences, whether it's filmmakers or, you know, composers or what have you, and or how do you work with those? Like, do you sit down and say, hey, send me a couple soundtracks or film scores that represent like the mood and style you want for this film, so I have an example, or I can send you a couple things that I think kind of represent the ideas I'm having? Like, what are some influences you have just in general? And then also, like, how might you use those influences as part of either being a filmmaker or a composer or both?
It's definitely about tossing music back and forth, which is just something I like to do with my friends anyway. But it's always fun when you meet like a new filmmaker or composer and you're like, oh, have you heard this person? Have you heard this person? And you just have that conversation. And then they're like, oh, I like this part of the music, but I don't like this thing. And it's fun as a filmmaker to know what you're trying to do, but it's also fun just as a music nerd to like share music with people. I know it's like a selfish composer thing, but I love when the music stands out or plays a huge part in the film. Like, it's fine when it's in the background or whatever. That there's a lot of movies that it should be that, but like when the music is central to the film or the TV show, I love it when it like is quirky and it stands out and it's kind of its own thing. Like the theme from Us, when it first played, I was just so excited about it. Like when there's just the shot zooming in on, I think it's like the rabbit cages or something at the beginning of the film. I was just like smiling the whole time. I'm like, I don't really care what this movie is. I'm just so happy right now. It's great. And thinking about that, or like White Lotus, the score for White Lotus, especially the first season, is amazing. Especially because like I don't think the show would work without it. It's like the music is so important to the tone of the show, and it's so like the driving factor of what the tone is. Like I don't think you would get the intensity or like the stressfulness of what's happening without that music. Is really interesting. I can never say his name. Cristobal. I can't remember his full name because I'm a horrible person. Michael Abels is the one that did the music for Us. The score for Annihilation is another film where it's like, I don't know if this is a good movie or if what it is, but like I love this movie specifically because of how it ends and what the music sounds like at the end. And it's like, if something happens at the end of a movie that's so amazing to me, it like makes the journey to it worth it. And like they could be stumbling the whole way. I think it's probably a good film. I don't know, but they could stumble the whole way. But as long as they get to that place, I'm ready to do that journey over and over again. And I love that music. So to me, it's always like music as a defining factor of a film is important to me, and it's what I would love to do. But I know a lot of filmmakers are like, I don't want the music to be the star of this film. So I'm always like, okay, and so I have to take it down. But when I do get the chance to do that, like 12-hour shift, it's pretty upfront, which I like, and it's nice to get that opportunity every now and then. And I mean, I like Danny Elfman, I like John Williams, all the regular guys. I can't think of anybody else.
Tangent note to what you just mentioned about the music like elevating the film or really standing out. And of course, there's a history of that, you know, Indiana Jones and Jaws, and I mean, even There Will Be Blood or what have you. There's all Psycho. Yeah. There's all these things where the music is so interlaced with the film. I mean, as much as people will quote certain famous movie lines, it's more so that they'll kind of like hum the music as a cue to be like, oh, now I see the thing that's making you hum that music. I see how that makes you think of the movie, but the cue isn't, hey, doesn't that building look just like the building from such and such? No, you just start humming the music, and then the people who know that, you know, it is such a way in. But it reminded me when I was in film school, one of the producers always said, it's really important what music you have over the end credits, because that's the last moment that you're going to have with the audience, because most people, as soon as the lights come up, they leave. So as they're walking out, they're hearing this song as like the outro. And if it's a terrible song that they don't like, it doesn't matter how good the music is or how good the movie was, they're going to be like, ugh. But it does work the other way. If it was kind of a meh movie, but they're walking out going, I love this song, this music is great. It's going to kind of color it the other way. So it can very much have a huge impact, because I have noticed on both sides, like good movie, bad music, kind of meh movie, but great music. You kind of forgive some of that because the music is so good.
I like the movie Cloverfield a lot, but there's no score in it except for the end credits where it's just like this amazing piece of music that Michael Giacchino wrote, I think. And it's like, it's so funny that like it's not really, it doesn't really need to be in there, but it's like its own standalone thing. And it like surmises what the movie would be with that score. It's really cool. It's a fun example.
Well, let me go back. You know, I talked about the pivot during COVID, and every person I've talked to, regardless of like where they are in the industry, as far as like what they're doing or what level, they all had this huge impact, because all of a sudden, you know, we can't go to set, you know, we can't get on stage, we can't go to the studio, like all those places are closed. So how, if at all, did that shift or cause you to make changes? Was it just, hey, things were on pause for a little bit and then it just went back to the way things were? Or was it a huge change where, well, before COVID, we did these things, and now after COVID, we're doing different stuff, or doing maybe the same stuff, but in different ways?
12-Hour Shift had gotten into Tribeca and was going to premiere at Tribeca in March of 2020. And then You Cannot Kill David Arquette was going to premiere at South by Southwest like 2-3 weeks later. And like, this is the first major film that I had scored. 12-Hour Shift. Tribeca is huge, and they like do a lot of cool stuff for composers. So it was like, this was going to be like launching my career in theory. And then COVID happened. They both got canceled. And we were planning to shoot a feature film in May of 2020. And my business partner had spent 6 months building this town for this Western called Ghost of the Ozarks. Ghost of the Ozarks? Yeah. I don't know why I couldn't remember the name. In Arkansas. And so I went down to visit the set in like March 8th or 9th or something like that. And then everything closed down around the world because of COVID. And I kind of got stuck in Arkansas because I didn't want to take a plane. And then, you know, South by Southwest got canceled, and Tribeca got canceled. And we became one of the first films to shoot during COVID with that. We went like, had calls with SAG all the time. We came up with like a bunch of the COVID policies that you do, like having certain levels and being tested and all this kind of stuff. So we actually ended up shooting this feature film in a bubble in Arkansas in June of 2020. It was like 30 people, maybe something like that, where we had our own hotel that was a floor that was just for us. No one else was allowed to go in. We were shooting on this town that my business partner had built. So we didn't have to worry about like strangers coming in. And so we ended up doing a film. Nobody got sick. We didn't have to get shut down. We shot successfully for a month and a half or however long it was. And so we didn't get that. I mean, it was like a nightmare because everybody wore masks the whole time, and you didn't know how much, if you were going to get sick any second, or what was going to happen, or the whole film was going to get shut down at any point, and you would have lost the ability to make this film. But we did it, and it worked, and we made the movie. And so we didn't have to wait like a lot of people did, which was really nice. And we also felt accomplished because we kind of helped get things up and running again. And then I spent the next 2 years doing post on it because I was colorist. I co-directed it, so I was in the editing bay, colorist, VFX, composer, and then I was also like, I don't know, the deliverables guy. I don't know what you call it, online editor or whatever. So I had to deliver everything. So I basically worked on it for another 2 years, which was intense and very long and horrible. So for me, it was only more of a delayed effect after that, because it was such a pain to do that we ended up, we haven't made I guess we just made another feature, but it really slowed things down like years later than I would have expected it to. At the time, you're like, oh, it didn't affect us, it's going to be great. And then you kind of catch the wave a little bit later, and you're like, oh, there it is.
You mentioned a couple times, and again, you just did, you're a business partner in the business. So talk to me a little bit about, you know, who you're working with, you know, what company you have. Is it a production company? Is it a music company? And so talk to me a little bit about what you've got and what you offer to people in whatever capacity.
It's kind of shifting now because my business partner moved to New Hampshire. So I'm a little bit more up in the air in that, where it used to be like we would work on every project together. We co-directed Ghost of the Ozarks and this other feature called Squirrel. I always did music by myself. He wasn't a part of the music, but he was more on the production design side, and I would shoot the film. So we were always working like kind of side by side, hand in hand. Anyway, but his life's going a little bit different direction. Not to say that we're not still going to be making stuff together in the future, but because of the distance now, I have to do a little bit more work by myself. So I'm not sure. It's an interesting question because I'm not sure if I have an answer for what that is. But I mean, I also work as a composer and a filmmaker by myself. I'm shooting a PBS food show for a friend of mine at the end of the week. So I'm still doing work on the production side of things as well. But composing seems to be the focus right now to some degree. And that's just my deal by myself at this point, depending on budget. You know, they get a bigger budget, you hire more people to work with you, which I guess doesn't answer your question. I don't know. That's interesting.
Well, again, it speaks to this larger thing of production in the industry is always in flux, and people who are within industry are usually in flux as well. And especially when we're not in, DGA level production mode, we are quite often switching and doing a lot of different roles and saying, well, in this project, I'm doing these 3 things. And then in the next project, I'm doing things 4, 5, and 6. And then another project, I'm doing 2, 4, and 6. Yeah. Because I guess have a lot of these things that we do.
Yeah, and I think I was just lucky that we happened to be in flux in the same direction for such a long time. And then right now we're doing a little bit of this, so I'm sure we'll meet back in a place again, which is just how it goes all the time. It's just we happen to luck out where we're in sync for such a long time.
Well, before we wrap up here in a minute, I always like to spotlight people and their work. And you mentioned a couple feature films. So talk to me about what you have out and where people can go see it, as well as where people can learn more about you, whether it's like a website or follow you on social or whatever you'd like to share.
Cool. So I think 3 main feature films out right now that are the most interesting. One's called Squirrel, which I wrote and then I directed with my business partner, Jordan Long, and I scored it and did a bunch of other stuff. Shot it 12-hour shift. I was the cinematographer. It's kind of a horror movie, kind of a funny horror movie. Cinematographer, composer, colorist, VFX, producer. That came out in 2020. That one's really fun. That's on Hulu. Squirrel's on Tubi. And then Ghost of the Ozarks came out in 2022. I directed with Jordan. I shot it. I did the music. I did the VFX. I did the color and a bunch of other weird crap. And that's on Tubi also. And they're all available on like iTunes and Amazon and all that stuff as well. Those are the 3 main ones. There's another one I just shot in December. I don't know when that's coming out though. We'll see. I have to do the music for that still. For my music, it's all on my music website is mattglass.net because I couldn't get .com. I'm still fighting that guy. Too many Matt Glasses out there. And then my everything else filmmaking, photography and stuff is on glassbrain.com. And then I'm on like Instagram is glassbrain, I think also. And I'm around, I guess.
Well, I'll make sure that the links to all of those are up on the screen for people.
Nice. I should have done one of these things and be like, here's this link. Here's this one.
We still can. I'll fix them. So I wanted to just ask briefly, we talked about the 2 main things, your filmmaker self and composer self. What, if any, notes do you have to anyone? Like most important lessons learned through either one of those lenses, things you wish you'd known that might be really important to hand out, or anything about how people might work with someone like yourself?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is there are historical paths to get to certain places. Like, oh, if you want to become a film composer, you go to school for composition here, and then you can make scores because you'll get connected with these people. Or like, if you're going to become a filmmaker, these are the schools for directing. These are the schools for writing or cinematography. I didn't do any of those things. I came to composing from like being in rock bands and being a drummer, and then which I think gives me a little bit of a different perspective than a lot of those people, which I think, especially nowadays, people are more interested in. Like there are definitely, the academic route is still definitely viable and you're definitely going to find jobs if you want to do that. But don't be worried if you're older or you come from some weird other area and you're getting into film composing, because the weird things that you came from might be the thing that make you unique enough that certain people want you over somebody else. And I think that's true of filmmaking too. Like I went to school for photography, so I'm not schooled in a lot of filmmaking jargon or like certain ways to talk on set, which can be kind of troublesome sometimes. But there's also an interesting perspective that comes from being a little outside of the box that maybe makes you more appealing than other people as well. And so just don't be afraid if you didn't follow the steps that are laid out ahead of you of how you're supposed to get there, because you never know what other path might take you to the same place or a better place.
And those are great notes, and I echo those. So as I mentioned, I'll share the links to your socials and your films. So want to just thank you for taking some time and talking about your career and some of the art you made. And look forward to hearing more about the new film that you mentioned that you're kind of finishing up right now.
Nice. Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thanks everyone for watching another episode of Film Notes. As I mentioned, this is a monthly show on YouTube, which you can watch. It's also a podcast. So if you're hearing this, please go to the YouTube channel and give it a watch. You can see the person I'm talking to, as well as all the inserts of their movie posters and behind the scenes photos, etc. If you are watching this and you'd like to share it with someone and it's easier for them to listen to, then please share the podcast, which is out on all the streaming platforms. And I look forward to seeing you on a future show next month.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the show, please click on the link below. You can also contact me at my website if you have any questions about filmmaking or anything else. Off to the side, you'll see a couple of my books, Film Notes and the Film Notes Workbook. I encourage you to check those out if you'd like to learn more about filmmaking. See you in the next episode.
Scene 1, Apple, take 1.